What if the first rebellion in creation wasn't Adam's? What if before Eden was ever planted, before dust became flesh, before Eve ever opened her eyes, there had already been a great fall, one that left a scar on the very fabric of heaven? The Bible hints at this, but never fully explains it. The story of Genesis opens like a dawn, crisp and orderly. Light, sky, sea, land, then man. But hidden just beneath the surface, there are ancient echoes, echoes of beings called the sons of God, echoes of joy at the foundation of the earth, echoes of a fall that shook heaven long before the garden was ever defiled. In Job 38:7, God asks Job, "Where were you when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy?" These sons of God were not men. They were present before Adam. Before Genesis 2 ever begins, they were already watching, already rejoicing, already aware. And that detail should unsettle us. Because if they existed before us, what were they? Why were they created? And what happened to them? Genesis barely touches this mystery. It offers no timeline, no warning, no theology of a pre-Adamic rebellion. But the pieces are there if you look closely. Genesis chapter 6, 1-4 speaks of sons of God who descended to take human women as wives. It tells of Nephilim, giants born of this union, and then, abruptly, the flood. As if divine judgment came not only for human sin, but for something far more ancient, something already festering beneath the surface. This isn't just myth. This isn't just metaphor. This is a tear in the narrative, a fracture in the story of creation that points to something we were never meant to forget. The fall didn't begin with Adam. It began with heaven's own sons, and that changes everything. But where Genesis remains silent, the Book of Jubilees dares to speak. It names names, it reveals dates, it exposes oaths made in secret and the consequences that followed. Jubilees doesn't contradict Genesis, it completes it. It doesn't invent a new story, it recovers one that was buried. And if that story is true, then Eden was not a pristine beginning, but a second chance, a fresh covenant written in the shadow of a cosmic betrayal. So ask yourself, why would Scripture hide this? Why would an entire order of divine beings created before us, gifted with authority, be nearly erased from the official narrative? And why, above all, would we be placed in their stead, fragile, dust-formed, and yet entrusted with the image of God? This is not just a theological footnote. It is the hidden foundation beneath your story and mine, a rebellion we inherited, a war we were born into, and a purpose we must now reclaim. Genesis opened the scroll. Jubilees dares to read what's between the lines. Let's go there. What if Adam wasn't the beginning, but the response? What if his creation wasn't the opening move of God's plan, but a divine countermeasure to something that had already gone terribly wrong? For generations, we've been taught to see Adam as the first chapter of human history, the start of God's intention for Earth. But what if that narrative only begins after an earlier plan had already fractured? What if Adam was never Plan A? According to the Book of Jubilees, the first day of creation did not simply produce light, it birthed order. And not just the natural order, but the heavenly one. Jubilees 2:2 states that on the very first day, God created all the angels of presence, of sanctification, of the winds, of fire and light, of darkness and snow, and of every spiritual power in the heavens. These weren't just messengers, they were the original inhabitants of the cosmos. They were God's first household. Before Adam ever walked the garden paths, these beings, sons of God, stood as radiant reflections of divine authority. They formed what ancient writings call the divine council, a structured hierarchy of heavenly governance. They were entrusted with oversight, dominion, and sacred duty. In Psalm 82, God is depicted not as dwelling alone, but as presiding over a great assembly, rendering judgment among the divine beings. This was not myth. It was the structure of heaven, ordered and functional, long before dust was given breath. But something happened. Some of these heavenly sons did not remain in their place. They descended. They crossed boundaries. They took what was not theirs to take. Genesis 6 gives us the faintest echo of this. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took them as wives. It's a chilling line, not because of what it says, but because of what it omits. Who gave them that authority? What gave them that right? The answer, of course, is nothing. It was an act of rebellion cloaked in desire. Now pause. If these divine beings fell before Adam was even formed, then Adam's story is not a standalone narrative. It's an insertion into a broken cosmos, a new beginning inside a world already marked by divine failure. That changes everything. That means when God said, "Let us make man in our image," he wasn't only speaking into creation, he was speaking into crisis. What if Adam was created to be the image bearer, not just of glory, but of restoration? What if humanity was designed not merely to exist, but to replace, to rebuild what had been defiled, to steward what the sons of God had corrupted? It's a staggering idea that you and I, flesh and blood, fragile and flawed, were not God's first family. But we were his chosen replacement, not born in Edenic innocence, but called into covenant amidst celestial ruin. Not plan A, perhaps, but the redemptive answer that heaven itself now watches unfold. Long before Eden blossomed, long before breath-filled dust, there was sound, cosmic, thunderous, and sacred. Job 38, 4-7 captures it. "Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth, when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy?" These sons of God were not men nor myth. They were divine beings, present not only before humanity, but before the earth itself had form. They rejoiced as witnesses of creation's first light, not because they were watching something foreign, but because they were part of the original cosmic order. They were home. The Book of Jubilees confirms what Job hints. In Jubilees 2:2, it states that on the very first day of creation, day 1, God created not only light, but the entire host of the heavens. Angels of presence, sanctification, spirit, fire, light, wind, and knowledge were brought into being. This was not a gradual emergence of spiritual beings. It was immediate, intentional. Before sun or moon or soil or sea, there was a hierarchy, a heavenly realm, a council. And this council was not symbolic. It was administrative, functional, strategic. In Psalm 82:1 we read, "God stands in the divine assembly. He judges among the gods." This isn't poetry, it's structure. Heaven, as depicted in Scripture, was never solitary. It was populated with divine sons, spiritual rulers, watchers, custodians of realms, agents of justice. The term sons of God, B'nai Ha-Elohim, refers not to Malachim, the messengers who go and deliver word, but to high-ranking figures who sat in the court of the Most High. They reflected his glory, executed his will, and formed a governing body, what scholars now call the Divine Council. To grasp this is to reframe Genesis entirely. The story of creation doesn't begin with a man in a garden. It begins with a throne surrounded by rulers, with a king establishing his heavenly government. The earth, when it emerged, did so beneath an already existing spiritual bureaucracy. It wasn't created for isolation. It was created for inclusion. And yet, into this order, a fracture would soon come. Because the Divine Council, though holy in origin, was not immune to choice. And where there is choice, there is risk. Some of these sons of God, endowed with authority and glory, chose differently. They did not remain in their appointed places. They broke rank. They abandoned their stations. And from this rupture came the first spiritual rebellion, not in Eden, but in the heavens. Before man ever knew temptation, the cosmos had already tasted defiance. This is the question we must now ask. What happens when those entrusted with divine governance choose ambition over obedience? What happens when the very beings created to reflect God's order choose to fracture it instead? The answer is not found in Genesis, but it is etched across the pages of Jubilees. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. It didn't begin with a whisper. It began with an oath, spoken not in secret, but in the open air of Mount Hermon, where the sky touches the heights and the earth bows in shadow. According to Jubilees 4:15 and expanded in the Book of Enoch 6-7, the watchers, those appointed to observe and protect, gathered and made a terrifying vow. Led by a being named Samyaza, they swore together that none would turn back once the rebellion began. Their words sealed a pact. If one fell, all would fall. Not one of them would be permitted to escape the judgment that would follow. This was not a spontaneous slip, not a tragic misstep caused by desire. It was a calculated collective defiance. These weren't angels caught in the web of love. They were architects of rebellion. The watchers saw the daughters of men, not with affection, but with a hunger for possession. Their mission had been to guard the human world, to protect the boundaries between heaven and earth. But they betrayed that mission. They crossed the boundary. They descended not to help, but to claim. And their descent had purpose. Once on earth, they took wives from among human women. From these forbidden unions came offspring not born of divine will, but of distorted ambition. Giants, Nephilim, beings neither fully divine nor fully human. But the Watchers did more than corrupt the bloodline. They introduced forbidden knowledge, enchantments, astrology, warfare, weapons, cosmetics, charms. They fractured the balance of creation. They did not merely trespass, they taught rebellion. They rewrote the rules of heaven and handed them to man. Mount Hermon, where they swore their oath, became the first altar of apostasy. Samyaza, Azazel and their kin did not act out of emotion, they acted out of strategy. This was a hostile takeover, a spiritual coup. By entering into union with humanity and giving them divine secrets, they sought to create a hybrid civilization that would rival the heavenly order itself. They weren't seduced by beauty, they were seduced by power. In doing so, they shattered the boundaries established by covenant. The Watchers were not mere violators, they were covenant breakers. And in the language of Scripture, to break covenant is to invite curse. Their sin wasn't personal, it was structural. The Watchers had been entrusted with sacred oversight, with divine responsibility, but through their oath, they severed heaven's legal claim over the earth. They transferred sacred trust into rebellion and seeded a war that would haunt creation long after their chains were forged. Jubilees names what Genesis leaves vague. This was not just a story of angels and women. It was the moment heaven was betrayed from within. And from that betrayal came judgment, and from that judgment came a silence that Eden would be forced to grow within. The fall did not begin in the garden, it began on the mountain, and the earth still echoes with the vow that was made there. The story of Eden begins with a garden, but not with peace, not with untouched beauty or serene beginnings. It begins instead in the long shadow of something lost. Genesis 6:1-4 offers a cryptic but staggering glimpse. When human beings began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took them as wives. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. It's a flashback, a dissonant echo. Something already happened. Something already went wrong. Genesis doesn't explain. It doesn't need to, because by the time Eden is introduced, the rupture has already begun. The sons of God had fallen. Their union with humanity had corrupted creation. The very structure of the cosmos had been shaken, and the garden was not a fresh start, but a sacred response. Jude 1:6 confirms it with chilling precision. The angels who did not keep their own position of authority, but abandoned their proper dwelling, he has kept in eternal chains under darkness for the judgment of the great day. And 2 Peter chapter 2:4 echoes, "For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into Tartarus and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness." These are not poetic exaggerations. These are historical indictments. Before humanity ever fell, heaven had already been breached. The Book of Jubilees in chapter 5 makes this explicit. It records God's judgment on the Watchers, not merely as divine disappointment, but as a righteous and unrelenting sentence. Jubilees 5:6 declares, "He bound them in the depths of the earth, and behold, they are in prison, and they are kept apart until the great judgment." The language is final. No redemption, no restoration. The fall of the sons of God was not a warning, it was a verdict. And yet, after this fall, after this divine upheaval, Eden is introduced, not as a beginning, but as a re-beginning, a garden planted in the soil of a corrupted world. A second stage. The first act, cosmic rebellion, had already played out off-screen, and humanity walks on stage without knowing what preceded it. The silence of Genesis is not emptiness, it's aftermath. This reframes everything. Eden was not a neutral space, it was a contested zone, a sacred territory established by God within a universe already scarred by betrayal. The serpent didn't sneak into paradise. He came from a war that had already started. He brought with him the echo of rebellion, the residue of a broken covenant made by others in another realm, long before man was ever formed from dust. To believe that Adam was the first to fall is to misread the battlefield. The first betrayal happened in the heavens, and Eden, far from being the origin of sin, was its next battleground. The audience of this story, us, must now reckon with a sobering truth. Before man ever broke faith, the cosmos had already fractured, and we were born not into innocence, but into a war that began long before we arrived. Why does Genesis remain silent? Why, after speaking of light and land and man, does it gloss over the very beings who shouted for joy as the world was formed and then fell in rebellion before Eden ever bloomed? Why are the sons of God introduced abruptly in chapter 6 as if they had always been there, as if their cosmic transgression was merely a footnote in human history? The silence is not accidental, it is deliberate, canonical, controlled. For centuries, readers have felt this gap. The space between Genesis 1 and Genesis 6 is cavernous, and yet we cross it in moments as if there's nothing missing in between. But something is missing, something massive, a story too ancient, too disruptive, too sacred, or too dangerous to be left in plain sight. A story that rewrites what we thought we knew about beginnings. Older texts like the Book of Jubilees and the Book of Enoch speak directly into that silence. They do not hesitate. They tell of the creation of angels on the first day, of a divine council set in place before time was measured. They name the watchers. They recount the oath sworn on Mount Hermon. They describe the birth of Nephilim and the consequences that fell like fire. They present a timeline that stretches back before Eden, before Adam, before the fall we've been told was the first. But these books were exiled, set aside as apocrypha, deauthorized, removed from public teaching. And we must ask, why? Why were these texts, revered in Second Temple Judaism, quoted in early Christianity, consistent with the echoes in Jude and Peter, sealed away? Why were they declared too much, too strange, too outside the line of accepted history? Perhaps it's because they confront us with a truth that we are still unready to bear, that sin did not originate with man, that the first covenant was not broken in a garden, and that the war for creation began in realms higher than earth. But silence does not mean absence. A page unwritten is not a page that never existed, and the forbidden history tucked between the verses of Genesis begs to be read, not to undermine Scripture, but to restore what has been lost. This is not about curiosity for curiosity's sake. It's about knowing the full scope of the world we were born into, the spiritual crisis we inherited, and the divine calling that was placed upon us not as victims of sin, but as agents of restoration. The silence of Genesis is an invitation to dig deeper, to search not for conspiracy, but for continuity, to see how the canon preserved just enough to provoke the faithful and how texts like Jubilees offer the key to what Genesis dares not fully speak. If Eden was the second chapter, we must ask, what was the first, and why was it hidden? Because in the story of the sons of God, in the rebellion before time, and in the silence that follows, lies a truth that reframes everything. And that truth still echoes beneath the surface of every page we thought we understood. After the floodwaters receded and the ark came to rest, the world was silent, but not safe. The giants were gone, but the spirits that sprang from them, the violent remnants of the Watcher's offspring, still roamed the earth. These disembodied beings, hungry and lawless, began to afflict the children of Noah, tormenting them with illness, seduction, and destruction. And so, Noah lifted his voice to heaven, crying out in desperation, pleading that all of these spirits be bound, erased, destroyed. He did not ask for justice, he asked for finality. But the response he received was not what he expected. Jubilees 10:7-12 tells us something Genesis never reveals, that in the aftermath of the flood, a figure named Mastema appeared before God. He is described not as a mere demon, but as the prince of hostility, the embodiment of accusation and opposition. And yet, he does not rebel. He stands within the divine court and makes a bold request that 1/10 of the evil spirits be allowed to remain, not to harm aimlessly, but to serve a purpose, to test mankind, to prove whether they would walk in the covenant or fall like those before them. And the staggering truth is this: God says yes. This is not myth. This is design. Mastema, like Satan in the Book of Job, is not acting outside the boundaries of God's rule. He is part of the machinery of divine justice. He does not tempt out of chaos, but out of permission. His very existence is tied to the testing of human faithfulness. He becomes the allowed adversary, the sanctioned tempter, the shadow against which covenant loyalty is measured. This reframes everything. Humanity was not placed into a neutral world. We were born into contested space. The rebellion of the sons of God had not only broken heaven's order, it had demanded a response. And that response was not merely punishment, it was trial. Humanity would now stand in the gap. We would be given a chance to succeed where the divine counsel had failed. But to do so, we would be tested. Mastema's presence is a theologically seismic revelation. He is not the enemy God forgot to defeat. He is the examiner God chose to allow. He does not destroy without restraint. He reveals the heart of those who claim to walk in the light. In this way, temptation is not an interruption to God's plan. It is an instrument within it. And so we arrive at the true crisis. The fall did not begin with Adam in the garden. It began with angelic rebellion in heaven. And the creation of man was not just an act of beauty, it was a response to betrayal. God made us not only in his image, but with an assignment, to uphold a covenant that others had broken, to remain faithful in the face of temptation, to resist the voices that once ruled the skies. We were born into war, but called to victory. And Mastema, dark and dreadful, is not the proof of God's failure. He is the permitted test of whether his new sons and daughters will stand. Adam was not chosen because he was the strongest. He was not created because humanity had earned some right to dominion. He was formed from dust, fragile, finite, and utterly dependent. And yet, into that dust, God breathed something more than life. He breathed purpose. Jubilees 3:8 says plainly, "He created man in the image of his own likeness, and he put into him eyes to see, ears to hear, and a heart to reflect, and intellect to reason." This wasn't a poetic flourish. It was a divine commission. The image of God was not a title. It was a transfer of authority. Adam received more than breath. He received the seat that others had forfeited. Eden was not simply a paradise. It was a throne room, a covenant space. The garden was walled not to keep man in, but to protect something sacred, a relationship, a structure, a trust. When God placed Adam there, he did so with intention. Adam was told to guard and keep it. These were priestly terms, covenantal terms. Eden wasn't just a place of pleasure, it was the first altar, the ground where heaven and earth met again after the council of heaven had fractured. This truth turns the traditional narrative on its head. Most teachings suggest that God gave law only after the fall, later at Sinai through Moses. But Jubilees declares otherwise. The law, the structure of divine relationship, was present from the beginning. Adam was not lawless in Eden. He was under covenant, a covenant of trust, of obedience, of sacred stewardship. The command not to eat of the tree was not arbitrary. It was sacramental. It marked the boundary between divine order and rebellion. And why was this necessary? Because the divine order had already been violated. The sons of God, who were entrusted with heavenly governance, had abandoned their posts. They fell not just in desire, but in duty. The image they were meant to bear was tarnished. And so God created another, one made lower, yet offered the same trust. Humanity did not emerge in a vacuum. We were not an experiment. We were a response. This means Adam did not walk into a blank slate. He entered into a world already bruised by betrayal. But unlike the Watchers, Adam was given no power to ascend, no wings to flee, no station in heaven to fall from. His greatness would not come from glory, but from obedience. He was the first man, yes, but also the first replacement, the one through whom God would re-establish what had been broken. And so, to carry the image of God is not to boast, it is to bear, to shoulder what others dropped, to guard what others defiled. Adam stood as the bridge, not merely between creation and creator, but between judgment and restoration. And though he too would fail, the covenant he received would not be revoked. It would echo through generations until one came who would fulfill it fully. To understand our beginning is to see ourselves not as accidents of creation, but as inheritors of a sacred trust. We were created to restore. We were born to replace. And the garden was not our reward, it was our responsibility. It is easy to forget that what we call the Bible today is not a complete archive, but a curated canon. Some books were included, others omitted. Some stories were expanded, others silenced. But what if one of those silenced texts held the very blueprint to a cosmic war long lost, and the reason we were created in the first place? The Book of Jubilees does not embellish, it reveals. From its opening chapters, it outlines a theological structure that stretches beyond Genesis. While Genesis 1 simply says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth," Jubilees 2 tells us what happened in the heavens, the creation of angels, their assignments, their roles. Jubilees 4-5 does not just mention sin, it narrates rebellion, divine judgment, the fall of watchers, and the cry of a broken creation. And in Jubilees 10, we witness the chilling agreement between God and Mastema, preserving a remnant of evil not out of mercy, but for the purpose of testing humanity's covenantal faithfulness. This is not myth, it is blueprint. Jubilees is the lost manual for understanding why humanity exists not merely as creatures, but as covenant bearers. Genesis recounts human beginnings, but Jubilees discloses the divine backstory, the rebellion that shattered heaven before Adam ever drew breath. Without it, the Eden narrative reads like an isolated morality tale. With it, we see a battlefield, a story of replacement, a mission to restore what was lost in a celestial revolt. And this is why its absence from the canon is so significant. Jubilees was not discarded for lack of clarity. It was silenced for its abundance of truth. It presents a version of cosmic history where angels are judged, where law is eternal, and where humanity is central not in pride but in purpose. Jubilees tells us that the covenant didn't begin with Moses. It was carved into heaven's tablets before time. That Adam was not a poetic invention, but a divine replacement. That Eden was not innocence, but assignment. What this means is staggering. The Book of Jubilees exposes the spiritual infrastructure of history. It explains why the war in heaven matters for the garden on earth, why judgment had already begun before Eden's trees bore fruit, and why redemption must be understood not just as forgiveness, but as restoration of an order that predates humanity itself. To read Genesis without Jubilees is to arrive halfway through the story, blind to the betrayal that necessitated our very existence. To ignore Jubilees is to remain deaf to the thunder that preceded Eden's silence. Jubilees does not seek to entertain. It unveils, it reframes. It restores the gravity of the human role, not as a fallible creation, but as a divine response. It reveals why Adam was marked by glory, yet surrounded by danger, why the law existed before the fall, why time itself is sacred, divided into jubilees, not just years. And perhaps that is why it was hidden. Because once you read it, the illusion shatters. You see the war. You feel the weight. You understand that humanity is not merely a story of fall and redemption, but of commission and reclamation. Jubilees is not an apocryphal side note. It is the hidden heartbeat of the entire cosmic plan. The missing chapter that makes every other chapter finally make sense. You were not created merely to survive. You were not placed on this earth to wander in spiritual confusion or to live out a faded echo of someone else's failure. You were chosen, and not just chosen to believe, but to finish what others abandoned. The angels who were meant to guard, who were meant to uphold the sacred order, fell. They forsook their posts. They broke the covenant. They descended not to help humanity, but to consume it. And when they forfeited their calling, the throne did not remain empty. Heaven did not retreat in silence. God initiated a plan so startling, it still shakes the foundations of every heavenly realm. He made man. He crowned clay with glory. He gave breath not just to survive, but to reign. You were made to be an image bearer. That phrase is not poetic, it's legal. It carries the full weight of representation. To bear his image means to carry his likeness, to act under his authority, to reflect his rule in a realm that had been tainted by treason. In Eden, Adam stood where angels once stood. He did not walk into a pure world. He walked into a battlefield, into the void left by the Watcher's fall. And though he too fell, the mission was never revoked. The purpose was never erased. The covenant, though wounded, was never abandoned. The Book of Jubilees helps us see this clearly. It doesn't reduce the human story to sin and suffering. It elevates it to cosmic commission. In Jubilees 3:8, Adam is not merely described as being made in God's image and likeness. He is bestowed that image as a sacred inheritance. It is the language of kingship, the language of agency. And from that first moment, the divine plan was never about starting over. It was about restoration. What was lost in heaven would be restored on earth, but not by angels, by us. This is why Paul wrote in Romans 8:17, "We are heirs, heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ." That declaration is not metaphorical. It means we are not merely saved from sin, we are reinstated into purpose. We are called sons and daughters, not slaves and strangers. In fact, 1 Corinthians 6:3 dares to say, "Do you not know that we will judge angels?" Why? Because we were created to fill the gap they left behind. Let that sink in. You were not born into a neutral world. You were born into the aftermath of a rebellion, and you were entrusted with a sacred charge to keep covenant, to guard time, to restore what was desecrated. The tablets Moses received were not the beginning of law. They were reminders of a law already written in the heavens. Jubilees tells us that law existed from creation, and that same law was breathed into you, not to shackle you, but to align you with the divine rhythm. The Watchers broke time, distorted sacred seasons, corrupted the order of heaven. But you were born into that broken order to walk differently, to live as one who honors the appointed times, to keep the covenant, to embody a new way of being, not defined by flesh, but by fidelity. This is why Jesus didn't just die to forgive sins. He died to inaugurate a new creation, a restored humanity, a people who would not only believe but embody the original call, "Be holy as I am holy." He didn't just fulfill prophecy. He re-established the plan. The last Adam didn't just repair what the first Adam broke. He gave us the power to walk where angels failed. And now you stand at the edge of that invitation. What was taken from heaven is being restored through you, not through temple rituals, not through hereditary priesthood, but through blood, His blood. Through obedience, through a heart that chooses covenant even when the world celebrates chaos. This is not a metaphor, it's a mission. Every act of faithfulness, every word spoken in truth, every time you reject compromise or temptation, you are doing more than choosing righteousness. You are reclaiming territory. You are fulfilling a blueprint that was once handed to angels and now rests in your hands. You are not meant to be passive. You are not meant to sit on the sidelines of history, waiting for heaven to intervene. Heaven has intervened. It intervened through Christ, and now through you. The Spirit placed in you is not a comfort blanket. It is a commissioning fire. You were chosen to complete what they failed to finish. You were chosen to carry the law not on tablets, but in your breath, your body, your life. The world may not recognize it. Religion may have forgotten it, but heaven has never revoked it. You are the continuation of a divine plan. You are the fulfillment of an ancient hope. You are the living answer to a rebellion that once scarred the stars. And when you walk in covenant, when you align your time, your choices, your heart with the divine pattern, you are not just surviving, you are restoring. You are not second best. You are not plan B. You are not a reaction to sin. You are the replacement for what fell. So rise, walk as one chosen to finish what was abandoned. Shine where others dimmed. Stand where others fell. Because heaven is not waiting for you to arrive. It's waiting for you to remember who you are. You were not made as a reaction to failure. You were not the backup plan after angels fell or Eden broke. You were made for the war that began before Eden ever bloomed. This is the truth Genesis only hints at, but Jubilees dares to declare. You were born into a world already scarred by rebellion, not to be lost in its ruins, but to stand as the answer heaven had prepared. Before Eden, before the garden, before even time was measured in days, the seeds of covenant were already sown. The fall of the Watchers did not catch God by surprise. The silence of Genesis is not ignorance, it is restraint. And what was withheld in plain sight was preserved in the sacred scroll of Jubilees. Jubilees is not just an old manuscript buried in some forgotten library. It is the blueprint of a war no one told you were born into. It names the rebellion, exposes the timing, maps the laws written on heavenly tablets, and reclaims the calling of mankind. Not as creatures begging for salvation, but as image-bearers summoned to restore what was lost. You were made to carry a sacred calling, not just to survive judgment, not just to believe doctrines, but to walk out a purpose older than Eden. A purpose that traces its origin back to a covenant breached by angels and extended to humanity by grace. This is not about earning worth. This is about responding to divine invitation, not because of your strength, but because heaven still trusts humanity with its mission. The sons of God, who once stood in radiant obedience, broke their oath. And in their absence, the earth did not fall into darkness alone. It waited. It waited for someone to pick up what had been dropped. That someone is you. This is why the Book of Jubilees matters, because it pulls back the veil. It does not flatter, it reveals. It doesn't comfort the religious status quo, it awakens the forgotten soul. It doesn't invent a new gospel. It reminds us of the full one, stretching back before Moses, before Adam, back to the moment when divine intention chose to act through flesh instead of fire. So now the question comes to you, not as a burden, but as a call. Will you walk as one who was chosen before Eden? Will you live as one who bears the weight and wonder of a hidden inheritance? Will you recover the truth that religion buried, that the Watchers feared, and that the covenant still waits to fulfill? This is not about adding another book to your shelf. This is about unlocking a part of yourself the world taught you to ignore. You were made for a covenant so deep it began before time. You were made to carry a lineage that outlived rebellion. You were made for a law that predates stone. You were made for the war before Eden, and now, finally, you remember.